My friends, believe me, I want to cover other topics than the Ukraine war. But every time I blink, there are more Russian flags being raised left and right.
Leave me alone!
We are winning!
Long story short, 2024 will be rough for our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia. And it's not me saying it. It's the commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade, Azov.
Авдіївка – це, мабуть, лише початок, і потрібно готуватися, як початок якоїсь такої їхньої нової кампанії. І я думаю, що потрібно готуватися до досить великих масштабів.
He's saying this because the eye of Sauron of the Russian army is currently focused on the Donetsk front. And the most problematic for Ukraine right now is Avdiivka. Because let me tell you, they're facing a girthy Russian offensive. Since the city fell, enemy forces have been building up on their latest successes. And now the Russians have achieved a hat trick with the capture of the settlements of Stepove, Lestochkine, and Svierne. By the way, that's exactly what we expected last video. The first step could be to clear this Orlivka salient, push the front line a couple kilometers. Now Ukraine is throwing everything they have to hold this line. To avoid this nightmare scenario, the Ukrainian army has sent its elite units like the Azov Brigade, the 47th Mechanized Brigade with its brand new M1A1 Abrams. And that's how they would decisively crush the Russians, at least in theory. Remember what the Sun wrote? Heart-stopping footage shows US-made M1 Abrams tank blasting Russians on Ukrainian front line for first time. And now we're even talking about 2 M1A1 Abrams destroyed, 300 meters from each other. What a disaster! And according to the latest news, a third one was destroyed. The latest one was ambushed by several Russian ATGM crews. All 3 were hit within a 500-meter radius. This means 10% of all M1A1 Abrams sent to Ukraine straight to the scrapyard within a week.
Saruman will have his prize.
The national interest promised us that Ukraine's M1 Abrams tanks could smash through Russia's defenses. Perhaps that's why when I click on the article, whoops, it's gone. Now further south along this Donetsk front line. Like firefighters, like devils marching towards the front. Some detachments of the Azov Brigade have been urgently redeployed towards Orlivka to stop the Russian assault in that direction. In that sector, the situation is difficult because the Russians skillfully coordinated and maneuvered their mechanized columns across open terrain right into the town.
Ад. Просто ад.
Meanwhile, the pressure is also increasing in and around Novo-mikhailivka, as Russian units of the 155th Marine Brigade claim to have stormed the eastern side of the village. And we'll also have to talk about the disastrous outcome of several Russian mechanized assaults, demonstrating the tactical inabilities of a lot of Russian officers.
Emotional damage!
Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. Make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. On the 21st of February, that was the situation on the Avdiivka front. This is when Ukraine had just lost all its positions inside the urban area. But they still held these villages west of Avdiivka.
But not for long!
The Russian army wanted to capitalize on their latest victories, keep the momentum going, and not allow the Ukrainians to form a new defensive line. The battle plan was to penetrate enemy lines, using a devastating and simultaneous 3-way pronged attack. The general assault started in the center. On the night of the 21st of February, a Russian mechanized infantry unit crossed this field. In the middle of the darkness, the BMPs disembarked their troops in this tree line. And that's when they got ambushed by Ukrainian artillery. Even worse for this attacking party. The Ukrainians counterattacked and essentially wiped them out, capturing a couple Russian soldiers in the process. Move 1, big fail. The next morning, the Ukrainians most likely attempted a counterattack to reclaim Stepove, but it seems to have been repulsed. We know this because they left behind a precious M1150 assault breacher vehicle. That's a US-made mine-clearing vehicle with the chassis of an Abrams, and this would foreshadow terrible events that would follow a couple days later. As you know, the best defense is offense. So I think that was the battle plan for the Ukrainians. Demonstrate strength to halt the Russians right in their tracks and force them to halt their offensive. On the 23rd of February, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade sent an M1A1 Abrams on a combat mission against Stepove. It was your typical shoot and scoot type of maneuver. In the meantime, Russian artillery batteries shelled all the villages in a 10-kilometer radius from Avdiivka. At the same time, things were brewing at the rear of the Russian army. As an example, here's a pretty rare HD footage of Russian soldiers aboard a Desert Cross 1000 ATV passing by a number of infantrymen. On the 22nd of February, the Russians launched a major attack against Vierne. They crossed 3.2 kilometers in open ground and reached the first houses of the settlement. That was part of the southern attack. Now it was time to repeat the attack in the center. Now, from a tactical perspective, you see the Russians had already captured part of this tree line, which was only 250 meters away from Lastochkine. That's equivalent to 2 football fields. In preparation for the assault, the Russians proceeded, as usual, wave after wave of FPV drones to clear the village of any vehicles, like this Ukrainian Humvee you can see on screen. And that's when the Siberian stormtroopers of the 35th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade swarmed Ukrainian positions. And here you can see the dreadful moment. The white, blue, red flag was raised on the village of Lastochkine.
Мы, бойцы 2-го стрелкового батальона 35-й отдельной гвардейской бригады, освободили поселок Ласточкино от нацистов. Победа будет за нами.
As Lastochkine fell into Saruman's grip, the Ukrainian defenders of Svierne were getting overwhelmed from every direction, and that's how they were forced to pull out towards Tonenke. Some of the troops defending these tree lines near Avdiivka were US and Canadian volunteers. And then there occurred a glitch in the matrix. An American foreign volunteer fighting for Russia, raising the colors of the stars and stripes on one of these settlements. Perhaps this was the first US versus US battle of the Ukraine war. The 47th Mechanized Brigade tried its best to prevent the entire front from crumbling by holding the northern flank. That's when, on the 25th of February, an M2 Bradley was hit on the outskirts of Ocheretine. And on the 26th, a second one was hit in the same sector, this time by an FPV drone. And for your information, in the days after that, we saw some of the most brutal fighting for that little settlement. Now Ukrainian forces held a new defensive line, with positions codenamed Maria, Irina, Laura, and Francesca. By the 26th of February, Russian troops exploded their breakthrough in Lastochkine and gained another 1.5 kilometers all around the settlement. Some units even reached the border of Orlivka, like this infantry squad that was then targeted by cluster munition, while others mopped up the remaining Ukrainian positions in Svierne. In this footage, you can see a drone guiding Russian riflemen in their combing operation of that settlement. In the north, the pressure was increasing on Berdishi. The Russians had fully secured Stepove, as you can see in this video of a soldier of the 15th Brigade. And that's when they pushed another kilometer westwards. Fun fact, from November 2020 to February 2022, the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade participated in the peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh. According to this video, we see the Ukrainians firing from Berdishi in the direction of Stepove against a Russian motorized unit that was advancing along this road. Now there must have been a problem with Ukrainian electronic warfare assets, because that same M1A1 Abrams from before was now being tracked by Russian drones. And that's when, shortly after,
No!
The M1 Abrams, king of the battlefield, had to lay down his crown. Here's the Russian soldier behind this feat of arms. Call sign Kolovrat, commander of the Black Hussars aerial reconnaissance platoon of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. Welcome to 21st century warfare. Here's a video of him explaining how it all happened.
Обнаружили цель, обошли его сзади, ударили в тыльную кормовую часть, первым бортом остановили танк, незамедлительно подняли второй борт, вылетели, он уже дымился, уже стоял на месте. Ударили под башню, и произошло возгорание боекомплекта.
On the 27th, new attempt to break out of the Avdiivka coke plant. Essentially, the Russians pushed in open terrain, hoping to get a foothold inside this tree line. In this video, you can see a Russian armored vehicle that eventually explodes and 5 men are seen running away towards the tree line. Those Ukrainian positions were really the last thing holding the Russians from moving on to phase 2. The enemy was already at the gates of Berdishi, Orlivka and Tonenke, so the center of gravity of this new Ukrainian line of defense was Semenivka, and in the worst case scenario, that settlement was protected by a couple of small lakes that could bottleneck Russian mechanized columns. So we know what happened next. More FPV drones! Like this one chasing down a BMP Bredli. Not Bradley, Bredli. On the 28th of February, the Russians decided to step up their game. That was the front line, and then 24 hours later, Ukrainian strongholds were falling one after the other. I mean, check out all the positions west of Sverny that were just abandoned. Half the village of Orlivka was also under Russian control. It's hard to say whether this was a planned retrograde movement of the Ukrainian army, or if it's more accurate to talk about a rout. Berdishi, 3 kilometers to the north, was getting pummeled by Russian MR-less systems. However, the Russians also got glazed pretty bad. In this video, we can see 2 of their BMPs charging towards Berdishi, when they just burst into flames because of camouflage TM62 anti-tank mines. And quickly enough, people realized there was an unusual amount of burnt steel in that frame. Here on Twitter, German journalist Julian Röpke wrote that Russians lost 13 armored vehicles west of Stepove. So this axis of attack was definitely costly in terms of equipment for the Russian military. If we look at a map, it's 800 meters of open ground between Stepove and Berdishi. So the local Russian commander thought there's no other way but just to charge, send in the vehicles one after the other. Nonetheless, the next day, advanced elements of the Russian armed forces reached the area of the destroyed M1A1 Abrams. Orlivka was now obviously inside the crosshairs. If that settlement fell, it would break the Ukrainian line of communications, and the Russians could break through this new Ukrainian line of defense. By the end of the 29th of February, pro-Russian military bloggers thought that the situation was in the bag. Rybar reported that the Ukrainians had abandoned Berdishi, Orlivka, and Tonenke. However, this report seems to have been very premature, aka fake news. Later that day, you can see Russian artillery shell Ukrainian positions in Orlivka, and with the following footage, we can see Russian BMPs pushing along a road. This frame was geolocated here, right at the entry of the village. And in that same video, we also see them bombard this position, so we can believe the Russians carried a simultaneous two-pronged attack. Now it was reported that the Ukrainians concentrated a lot of firepower, all the 155mm artillery, right in that direction, plus all the Ukrainian FPV drones that were harassing Russian infantry units that were taking positions in abandoned trenches. The dream started to collapse with this video from the 3rd of March, showing a Russian patrol right at the center of the settlement, thus confirming their capture of at least half of Orlivka. If the Ukrainian army lost combat position Maria, aka Berdishi, then the situation would become extremely critical. Enemy forces could quickly flank Semenivka from the north. In other words, there would be no more settlements or terrain features to stop the Russians. If this happens, we can expect the Russian armed forces to advance another 6 kilometers west in my opinion, it's only here that we can expect the Ukrainians to halt the Russian breakthrough. There's this set of small lakes, ponds, and even this small river that would make a solid natural line of defense. And of course, this would be bad news for enemy mechanized columns. In that hypothetical scenario, to avoid being stuck, the Russians could focus their attention on Step 1, Solovyove and Novo-mikhailivka, and Step 2, Ocheretine. Now, to avoid this disaster, the Ukrainians quickly counterattacked in Berdishi on the 1st of March. The drone operators of the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov released multiple drone footage of strikes on isolated groups, making Russian soldiers dance the cha-cha-cha. Alright, the moment has come. There was this viral video of a Russian BTR-80 pushing inside the village of Berdishi. We can even see the previously destroyed M1A1 Abrams on the left-hand corner. This BTR disembarked an entire squad of 12 riflemen. I mean, look at this crispy HD footage. And that's when they got ambushed. An M2 Bradley IFV of the 47th Mechanized Brigade showed up and ripped through these guys at point blank. I mean, these guys were camouflaged, but they stood no chance against the Bradley's 25mm chain gun. I could visually confirm 5 to 6 Russian KIAs out of the original 12. And at the end, we see the Ukrainian soldiers counterattack and take hold of the position. So we're starting to see a pattern. The Ukrainians let the Russians advance, and then they counterattack immediately, inflicting heavy losses. Guess what happened the next day? Another BTR pushed towards Berdishi, and once again it was hammered by the M2 Bradley's 25mm gun, causing the defeat of an entire squad. This goes to show Ukraine needs more of these Bradleys. What are you waiting for? With that being said, there are equally brutal losses on the Ukrainian side. We don't have much information, but we know that a large Ukrainian mechanized column attempted to counterattack in order to regain the village of Orlivka when they were allegedly hit by 6 Su-25 attacked aircraft. We can count the destruction of at least 5 armored vehicles, including a German-made Marder IFV. On the 2nd of March, right at this position, DPR troops of the 1st Slaviansk Brigade planted their pole inside Francesca, aka Tunenke. Francesca. Yup, it's hard, but Francesca's gone, boys. She's gone for good. Now, big turnaround. A second M1A1 Abrams was destroyed in Berdishi on March 3rd, not even 300 meters away from the first one. According to Russian sources, the Abrams was hit by an RPG striking the Caterpillar, and then it was finished off by an FPV drone. According to the latest news, Russian assault detachments have made further gains inside Berdishi. And that's exactly where the 3rd US-made Abrams was destroyed. All 3 US-made tanks abandoned within a 500-meter radius. As a reminder, the Battle of Avdiivka is only one part of the sequence of operations along the Donetsk front. Since its capture, Marinka has become the center of gravity of multiple Russian attacks in that sector, namely another 3-way playground. One important objective to capture was the farm and hamlet of Pobieda. The danger for Ukraine was that if the Russians captured it, they could slide right into the DMs of Konstantinivka. And of course, Ukraine is very possessive and they don't want that. Using a 3D map, we can see how much of a cute little village Pobieda used to be. And that was before it became a Marinka 2.0 and it got shelled into oblivion. Here you can see an entire Ukrainian squad exiting from what seems to be a basement. And you can see all the houses around are in ruins. The Russians continuously bombarded the settlement and forced the defenders to abandon their combat positions. That's how, on the 20th of February, the Russians pushed 1.3 kilometers along this road right into the settlement. Here you can see how the Ukrainians deployed the Leopard 2 tank on the southern part of the village. It was positioned in a way to have clear sight on the road, all the while being camouflaged by all the ruins and the surrounding rubble. Mikhail Wittmann would be so proud. Eventually the Leopard 2 was spotted by an enemy drone, and that's when it got targeted and destroyed. As of now, according to Deep State UA, half the village is still in the gray zone. On the 23rd of February, the Russian command turned its Eye of Sauron towards Krasnohorivka. In this one, Russian aviation released an FAB on the Ukrainian stronghold of that town. According to Ukrainian sources, the town was only defended by a battalion of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade. So the next day, the Russians attempted a mechanized assault somewhere north of Krasnohorivka. But just like with my last relationship, nothing substantial came out of it. On the 27th of February, Russian stormtroopers advanced over a kilometer towards Krasnohorivka. And we can even believe some detachments made it right into the residential sector. On top of that, there are visually confirmed Ukrainian tank losses in that sector. The defenders of Krasnohorivka were feeling the heat.
Красногорівка, жесть. Русня тисне дуже сильно. Нас позиції вчора вибили.
So Azov detachments arrived to save the day, namely the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, that just participated in the Avdiivka rescue mission. Now they're back on the front, plus the 1st Company, 2nd Battalion as well. According to them, the Russians got expelled from the residential sector and lost over 100 casualties.
You just need to believe.
If on the tactical level, a lot of the Russian mechanized assaults near Avdiivka were poorly led, we have this splendid footage of the assault on Krasnohorivka by the 5th Guards Tank Brigade, debunking all the nonsense theories of human wave attacks, meat wave attacks, whatever you want to call them. It started with a preparatory artillery barrage to soften enemy positions. Multiple armored columns pushed forward. They skillfully maneuvered to avoid minefields, all the while being protected by main battle tanks. That's when they disembarked entire squads of fighters right into the residential sector, in order to avoid them being exposed to enemy firepower, whereas the neighboring tree lines were later calmed by the 2nd wave of infantry. If the Russian army can repeat such assaults, it's gonna get really bad on the front line. Now, if we analyze on a tactical level the footage we just saw, we learned that a Russian armored column advanced through this field, maneuvering and bypassing around this minefield, after which they broke through the tree line and then rushed towards the residential sector, where they disembarked their squads of riflemen. And the images of the 2nd wave combing the tree line must have happened somewhere here. Like we said before, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians have been expelled from Krasnohorivka. According to pro-Russian sources, they have reached all the way up to this street. Time will tell. In regards to the central thrust of this three-way, Russian assault units have gained another kilometer of land towards the village of Orlivka. This careful retrograde movement of the Ukrainian forces is probably due to their inability to send reinforcements to the contact line due to the continuous enemy bombardments. And let's move to the final chapter, Novo-mikhailivka. That was the front line on the 10th of February, with a Russian attempt to flank the village from the south. By early March, we see that the Ukrainians counterattacked in the south, but at the same time, they had to give up their positions in Pobieda, like we saw earlier. Then Russian assault detachments have also managed to anchor themselves in the eastern part of Novo-mikhailivka, which they celebrated by planting this flag. But let's backtrack a bit to the 13th of February. The Russians had made gains east of the village prior to launching the general assault. You have to know that the Russian aviation completely fabbed the entire village, and any possible stronghold was reduced with massive 500-kilogram bombs. On top of that, to soften Ukrainian positions and to allow a smooth entry of mechanized columns, the Russians also managed to destroy 2 Ukrainian tanks geolocated here and here. Oh, you thought it was done? Then it was Russian MR-less systems that joined the symphony. The tactical problem remained the same as in the previous weeks. The Russians would have to drive along this straight 1,700 meter long road, fully exposed to Ukrainian firepower. On February 27th, multiple armored vehicles were sent forward, but as you expected, the attack failed. After weeks of continuous assaults, we see a total of 25 burnt and abandoned Russian armored vehicles along this road. However, that's not all. 4 BMPs also tried to cut right across this field towards the river where they seem to have been stopped by some kind of minefield. Anyway, we can confidently say that the Ukrainian 79th Air Mobile Brigade is a top G brigade. They're definitely doing a good job at holding the place by themselves. Oh, surprise, surprise! March 1st, the Russians are back. Of course, there will be no Ukrainian drone footage of Russians successfully storming the village. In other words, we don't really know how they did it. All we know is that they celebrated the capture of this farm by planting the white, blue, red flag. Remember, it's the second time that the Russians captured this place actually. And a couple days later, there are rumors that the Russians raised another banner, this time right at the center of Novo-mikhailivka, with Russian attacks in this direction, here, there, here as well, and in this direction. The next logical step would be another push against Vuhledar in order to eliminate this Ukrainian salient. Coincidence? On the 28th of February, there was a heavy Russian rocket attack against Vuhledar. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.